Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for joining us today. This is our session on the route to net zero. Some of you may have already attended our previous session that we also did with our friends at Carbon Intelligence on understanding your carbon footprint. And in that, we discussed the types of emissions, elements of carbon footprint, as well as talking about some of the trickier issues such as supply chain emissions and their complexities. In this session, we're going to move that conversation forward. We're going to be talking about the route to net zero. I hope you've all got, hopefully, your phones within reach, because we're going to do a quick poll, and it's the first time I've tried doing this at the same time. So if you could grab your phone, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the route to net zero, where you are on your journey, understanding how you can start that sustainability journey if you haven't done already. A couple of quick housekeeping things. So there is a Q&A, which you should see. Please do ask any questions. We're going to try and keep this to about 30 to 45 minutes with some time for questions at the end. So do pop any questions in the Q&A box. So we're going to go to the poll. The website is slido.com. Hopefully some of you have used this before. It should be on your screen, slido.com. Please do just open a browser, go there. There's a hashtag, it's net zero. So if you go on there, and then the question we've got for you is, does your business have a plan in place to reach net zero? So if you could just pop one of the answers in there. So yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Or frankly, I don't know if we've got a plan. And it'd just be really useful for us to gauge what stage you're at in your journey. So please do go on to slido.com and it's hashtag net zero. We've got one respondee, and yes, their business does have a plan. So we'll just give it 30 seconds or so just to see if we've got any more respondees. Give you a second to go on there. You can grab your phone or your web browser and should get you to the Slido page. Oh, we've got a few more people there. Oh, okay, so we've got a little bit of a mix. Oh, the no's are going up, which we've got a few more responses here. So let's give that a second. So far we've got 8 responses. So far we've got about 2/3 of you. Yeah, your business does have a plan. I think the interesting thing there is we've got 20% which say no, and 20% which don't even know if you've got a plan. So that's great. And whether you've got a plan or not, this is hopefully going to really help you. This session is going to help you really understand actually how can you take that plan forwards, how can you move it to the next stage. I'll talk a little bit about actually what Irwin Mitchell are doing, because this is quite new to a lot of businesses, and it is a process, and I hate the phrase, but it is a journey. So we're going to talk about through some of these things. So I'm going to hand over to our co-hosts of this, which are Carbon Intelligence, and I'm first of all going to hand over to Becky, who's going to introduce Carbon Intelligence and then talk us a little bit through the agenda for the day. So over to you, Becky.
Yeah, thanks, Faye. Hi, everyone. So just by way of brief introduction, so I'm Becky. I'm a senior analyst here at Carbon Intelligence in our supply chain services team. I'll just quickly hand over to my colleague Sylvia to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sylvia Jean. I'm an associate director at Carbon Intelligence, and I work with Becky with our clients to help them in their net zero journey. Good morning.
So for those of you that don't know us, Carbon Intelligence is an end-to-end sustainability partner for our clients across multiple sectors. We work with them on multi-year projects on things like science-based target setting, supply chain, sustainable procurement, and greenhouse gas reporting to help them achieve their carbon reduction goals. So we're a large team of world-class strategists, data analysts, technologists, engineers, grown by the day, and truly believe that business is a solution to a zero carbon future. So we've set almost half of the UK's science-based targets aligned to 1.5 degrees, and are really proud to work really closely with the Science Based Targets Initiative themselves, CDP, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development as well. So just on to the next slide. As we saw by the results of that poll, there is understandable that a lot of you here are at varying stages of your sustainability journeys and have had really different experiences along the way, no doubt, as well. So today we're really looking forward to shedding some light on the topic of net zero more broadly. why we need to take action now, and how we tackle actually setting those targets. So towards the end, we'll probably open the floor up to any questions. So feel free, as Faye said, to use that Q&A box up the top there. But first, I'll just quickly hand back over to Faye to take you through Irwin Mitchell's journey so far and bring this topic to life.
Fantastic. Thanks, Becky. If we go on to the next slide, we can show you a little bit of the Irwin Mitchell's progress towards net zero. And I think, like most businesses, we are moving forwards, but it is a journey. If we click on, there should be some text which comes up here, rather than just a pretty picture, and there should be some more text which fills in, which we will send the slides as well. I should have said that at the start. We will send you the slides so you can read this as well afterwards. But so our journey is, we've defined our roadmap to net zero, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the session. But what that means is we're doing a few things. And first of all, we're really getting the data. And I think what will really come through in this webinar, I hope, will be how important it is for us to get that data and to move in order for us to actually track our roadmap. So we are committed to getting science-based targets initiatives. And again, the Carbon Intelligence team are going to tell you a little bit about what SBTI means. We are getting those verified this year. We are also investing in an environmental reporting platform, which I think is the next point on the slide. We're investing in a reporting platform because, as I say, that data, it's really important to be able to collate that data and then report on it. That's really critical. One of the next points on there is our governance framework. And actually, this is something that's really important. And whilst we can all have a route to net zero, we can all calculate our carbon footprints, that sort of thing. If we are going to say, actually, we're going to move on that route, who's holding your business accountable? And what we've done is strengthened our governance framework so that it's now at board level. So our board are providing oversight and accountability for our journey towards net zero. We're actually producing a report on governance with the G in ESG, and that should be out in the new year. And I think it's really relevant that actually we don't just talk about our route to net zero, but actually how we're going to hold ourselves accountable for that. We've also maintained some of our current sustainability ratings and improving our environmental scores. And we've also published our responsible business report, which you can find on our website. And I think that, again, is really important from a transparency perspective. So from an Irwin Mitchell view, we are at the start of that roadmap. What we're really trying to do is get the information, verify that information, and then that will help us plan the next steps to how we reduce our carbon footprint and how we get to net zero. So now I'm going to hand back to Becky.
Thanks, Faye. So no, it's really interesting just to set the scene there. It kind of leads nicely into this. And this is the why are we doing this in the first place? So sadly, extreme climate events are becoming the norm due to human activity, and global heating is increasing a lot faster than expected or ever predicted. And as the majority of you probably already know, it absolutely goes without question that we are facing, if not already in the middle of, a global climate crisis. I really like this graphic here by WWF as it flicks between the two scenarios of 1.5 and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So it gives a real visual representation of the direction the world is heading in if we actually don't act and tackle our emissions now. So while a 0.5 degree difference doesn't seem that significant, the physical impacts are actually huge. So just for example, at a 1.5 degree rise, we could experience ice-free summers in the Arctic every 100 years, 70 to 90% world reef loss, and say 1 billion people exposed to extreme heat waves. Which is obviously bad enough. Whereas in a 2 degree scenario, it's ice-free summers every 10 years, 99% of world reef loss, and 2.7 billion people exposed to extreme heat waves. So there's a real difference there. And sadly, the current policies that we have in place aren't enough to tackle this challenge. So we really need to act now to minimise the worst impacts on climate change for our planet, society, and also businesses within that as well. But the good news is we have the power to stop it. And at Carbon Intelligence, as I said before, we truly believe that business is the solution here. So we'll just take you through this in a bit more detail.
Thanks for that, Becky. I'm just going to jump in because I think you've scared everybody in the room with that. And it's really relevant at the moment because obviously we've got COP27. So there's a huge amount of talk about how important it is to try and keep at that 1.5 degree level. And clearly more needs to be done. And I think that's recognised by government, by businesses and by individuals. So having seen the scary side, perhaps Becky, can we be a bit more positive about the future? Are there things that are being done that we can do?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So if you just jump onto the next slide, there is urgent action on climate change being taken at all levels over the world. So at country level, for example, back in 2015 now, there were 195 countries signed up to the Paris Agreement, which required all signatories to pledge what they would do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 or 2030. And this really highlighted that sheer scale of international cooperation and instigated a really tangible drive towards positive change. And it's kind of only increased since then. And then there's investors who are also piling on the pressure to drive those changes and continue to back companies with those environmental, social and governance resolutions in place. So, for example, the Climate Action 100, for example, is an investor-led initiative aimed at ensuring the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters are actually taking the necessary action on climate change to reduce investment exposure and secure those ongoing sustainable returns. And then you've got the clients who are increasingly requesting information from their suppliers on how they're reducing their emissions, which some of you might have experienced already. So as the demand for low carbon products and services increases, the ability to respond to these requests will give you a really competitive edge and demonstrate to your stakeholders that you're already making those changes and have a plan in place, taking responsibility. So we're finding that companies who set their net zero targets now or have a plan to do so are increasingly expecting their supply chain partners to follow suit. And that starts this kind of knock-on domino effect, a positive one as well. And also public awareness of climate change is on the up, and consumers are increasingly choosing products from brands who can credibly demonstrate that they are taking action. So that's really important as well. And then for business, so climate risk is already really tangible and impacting every sector. So those that move fast now will really benefit the most down the line. And also legislation and policy frameworks are becoming increasingly stringent. So with all this taken into account, it's really important that businesses start taking action if you haven't already. And, you know, we saw from that poll that some people have a plan in place and some people are very much at the beginning of their journey. So it's really time to join the force and start to integrate your net zero carbon reduction plans. And this is really where the science-based targets come into play.
And Becky, you mentioned science-based targets, and I explained that's something that we're using at Irwin Mitchell to try and get some data around how we move our route to net zero. Can you just explain what they are and how they work? Because I think there's so much sort of jargon that goes around net zero and carbon and etc. And it'd be useful just to get a better understanding of science-based targets and how people can be using them in their roadmap to net zero.
Yeah, sure, and you're right. I think there is a lot of jargon and people use different terms. So I think if you just jump to the next one, I think the Science-Based Targets Initiative really mobilizes the private sector to take the lead on climate action and really enables companies to set science-based reduction targets for their emissions. It has the goal of halving global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and then reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So it really shows companies how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent those worst impacts of climate change that we saw on that WWF slide before, and leading them on a clear path towards decarbonisation. So I believe as of November 2022, there's over 2,500 companies now set or committed to setting a science-based target, which is huge, and that keeps going up every day. So it really is becoming the norm. And if you jump to the next slide there, So you can see that it's becoming the norm across all sectors. And over time, as I said, there's more clients of yours, or even investors perhaps, that will start asking for your science-based targets, commitments and your net zero goals, which is really another reason why it makes sense to start now and get ahead of the game.
Fantastic, thanks Becky. I think that's really helpful just to understand how many businesses are taking this on board, and as I say, we are doing so, and I think more and more are. I think that you mentioned clients and investors. We're finding when we're doing our tenders and proposals to clients, they're now asking us about our route to net zero and our science-based targets and that sort of thing. So it is something that I think all businesses can expect to see. We just go to the next slide. We're now going to talk about what is net zero. And I think, again, there's some confusion around this. I think historically, everybody just thought, oh, well, net zero, what we're going to do is we're going to offset everything. And that, frankly, has changed massively. I know EasyJet, for example, used to offset the carbon for every single flight. They've actually now changed that and said, we're not going to do that because it's not the right way forward. What we're going to do is focus on actually how can we reduce our emissions. So I think there has been a sea change in getting to net zero from just offsetting to actually how can we do this in a more sustainable way. So again, Becky, could you talk about how businesses should be looking about that route to net zero and what it should, they should start planning for that?
Yeah, sure. So if you jump onto the next one, so yeah, as you said, Faye, it's a term that we've been hearing more and more lately, and it really has become that guiding principle for action on climate change. So it's now synonymous with targets that tackle climate change for both countries and businesses as well, and really refers to the reduction of carbon emissions of a business during the course of its operations, such that the annual total is zero when including those carbon removals and offsets at the end. So now setting the science-based target now consists of defining a near-term target, a long-term target, and also a removal strategy, which you can see here. So just to break it down, the large blue bars really highlight your overall business emissions over time from left to right. And then that diagonal line represents the target trajectory, showing the reductions that your organisation would need to make in order to be aligned to that 1.5 degree pathway, which, as we saw before, keeping global temperatures increase to within that 1.5 degrees. And then the thick purple line demonstrates your near-term science-based target, which is that interim reduction target of about 5 to 10 years. And the reason for having one of those is to promote quick action for the deep emissions reductions to be achieved by 2030, before you head into your long-term target. So then the dotted pink line shows that long-term target there, and this has to be the same baseline as your near-term target, so they both start at the same point. Your long-term target date is the year in which you are able to reduce your emissions by 90% from your baseline, and this can be any year before 2050. And this really is used to influence business planning in order to reach the level of global reductions needed for that truly net zero world by 2050, if not sooner. So yeah, basically then the emissions left over at the end will be regarded as residual emissions, and these are those that you're not able to decarbonize. And in order to claim net zero by your target date, these emissions really must be balanced through carbon removals on an annual basis. And this is represented here by those little green boxes at the end. So just to reiterate there, so there's 3 elements to a credible net zero pathway. So there's a near-term target, a long-term target, and a removal strategy. And this really ensures that we have to rely on as little as possible on offsets to achieve net zero.
Thanks, Becky. I think that's really important to reiterate that it's not just about saying, right, we can offset and pay for offsets. It's actually looking at how you can reduce your current emissions. And I'll talk a little bit later on about what we're doing within Irwin Mitchell on that. So that's kind of what businesses need to be doing. We're now going to look at and this was a question we had in advance, is what does good look like? What does great look like when you're setting your net zero plan? And Sylvia's going to be explaining what businesses are people doing and more importantly, what they should not do. So I'll hand over to Sylvia now to take us through what great looks like.
Thanks, Faye. Yes, let's have a look at the different level of ambition and what great looks like for businesses. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as you can see at the bottom half of this chart in blue, so this represents the ambition that we consider no longer credible. So starting at the bottom, basically when there's no climate mitigation target set by businesses. So this is your operating your business as usual, which as it stands will land us on a 4-degree increase in global temperatures. So based on what Becky presented earlier, this is really not the way we want to go. So then moving up, but still in those blue boxes, we find companies that have a reduction target, though those reduction targets have not been approved by the Science Based Targets initiative, nor there is a long-term decarbonization strategy. So for context here, the term carbon neutral has come now to reflect the act of offsetting all the emissions generated by the business through their operation and value chain. So based on what Becky explained before about what is really a credible net zero strategy, this offsetting term has now been incorrectly being used and is now considered to be basically greenwashing. So moving into what good looks like, it's in those pink and purple section. And this is where business really should be aiming in terms of credibility. So the ultimate goal at the top really is to have a net zero plan with a near and long-term science-based targets where only the residual emissions are neutralized. So this is how business can actually claim net zero through the science-based targets. Next slide, please. So to add to the previous slides, there are many factors that can make your net zero strategy much less credible and leave you falling into those blue boxes that we highlighted in the previous slides. So as we said at the start, a 2-degree target is really no longer enough to tackle the climate change challenge. So you need to have a net zero strategy aligning to anything other than 1.5 degree scenario will be no longer deemed credible. So we've already discussed offsetting as one of the pitfalls, which is pictured in the middle here, and this is really not an option anymore. Then in terms of another pitfall, we have exclusion of other greenhouse gases. So we tend to generally think about CO2 or methane when we think about GHG emission, but we do need to take into account other harmful GHG emission as well. And another pitfall is basically not capturing all of your impacts across the different category of the GHG protocol. So it's really important that your net zero strategy consider all of the sources of emission, including the scope 3 categories. There are 13 of them. So if you take the time to ensure that you have a credible net zero strategy, we actually really think it can generate value for you and your stakeholders.
Thanks, Sylvia. And that's a really important point, actually, about the stakeholders, because persuading your board and the rest of the company of the benefits of the route to net zero is really key. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, we're certainly seeing a lot of our clients ask us about this. So perhaps you could just talk a little bit about the value and the need to driving net zero, and actually for businesses, how they can see it as a positive and not actually a drag on the business, particularly, frankly, in challenging times that we've got at the moment. So perhaps you could talk about some of the benefits that businesses can see and the upsides from this.
Yeah, sure. Next slide, please. Yes. So, like we've mentioned, there are benefits to setting up those net zero and science-based targets. So the first one really, it's around cost reduction. So it might be obvious for some and less obvious for others, but really finding opportunities for emissions reduction tend to drive cost reduction through basically improve efficiencies and optimization within your business. The second one is about risk mitigation. So the process of setting net zero target it's a challenging but very interesting exercise, right? To look at your business exposure. So through those exercises, you will get to understand both the physical and transitional risk exposure in various different climate scenarios, and you will basically uncover assets and business area that actually are high risk in relation to climate change event. So it's great to get on top of that before it's too late. A third benefit, it's around growth and productivity. So going through this exercise offers your business a chance to really tap into additional growth and productivity by unlocking innovation and new business opportunities along the way. Typically working with your supplier and your customer on emission reduction initiative is always a great new business opportunity. And finally, one of the last one is around investment. So of course, your stakeholders and investor will be looking at the environmental performance of their company. So really taking the lead on this will really put your business ahead of the pack.
Thanks, Sylvia. I think that's some really, really important messages there in terms of actually how you can use this for your business. A couple of examples I wanted to share with you in talking to some of our clients. One was a plastics business, which you would think isn't at the forefront of the route to net zero, but actually what they've done is they have looked really hard at their business and they've managed to reduce the amount of plastic they were putting into their packaging. And what that has done is twofold. One, it's reduced obviously their emissions, but also frankly it's reduced their costs because they're using less plastic, so it's made them more profitable. So actually this can be really important for businesses. And the other thing to mention is, speaking to a lot of banks and investors, they are now looking at sustainability and the route to net zero when they're looking at, for example, debt applications, when it's going to credit approval. And good governance there is key, and really ensuring that if you've got a plan, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's being held to account and being actionable. So you can't just say you're doing it, you actually must do it. But it is going to be more and more important for businesses in terms of accessing finance, investment, and that sort of thing. So I think that's really important. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Irwin Mitchell and what we're doing. And if you click on the slide, hopefully it will bring up the things that we're doing. But here you can see, hopefully you can see on the screen, our roadmap to net zero. And we have followed the process that Becky was talking about there, which is having some short-term targets. So renewable electricity by 2025. Also by 2025, reducing our scope 1 and 2 emissions on our footprint by 60%. And then we've got the longer term plan, which is looking at our scope 3. And for those who joined us on the previous session about carbon footprints, you will understand that scope 3, frankly, is a bit of the harder thing. That's the bit which is outside your control. And that's why for us, it's a longer term process. There's a few other things that we've done. We've also joined the United Nations Global Compact. That's great because it's enabled us to engage with the United Nations Global Compact on becoming a responsible business, reducing our route to net zero. But what it's also done is provided a lot of information for our staff and our teams about how important it is and how they can get engaged. And I think that company buy-in has been a really important part of our journey to being a responsible business to our route to net zero. I mentioned earlier about data. And for us, the next point on the slide is verifying our science-based targets. And we are currently going through that process, and we hope to have them all reviewed and confirmed by February 2023. And that then really enables us to push forward with our roadmap. So we will then be producing our first net zero plan, which will detail our targets, our milestones, and that long-term, short-term, and then long-term plan to net zero. So for us, we are at an early stage, but what we are doing is ensuring we're working with the right organisations and we're getting verifiable targets here as well. So I'm now going to hand back over to Becky, who's going to talk us about the next steps and some of the things and resources that are available to you.
Sure, thanks, Faye. Sorry, mine cut out a little bit then. So yeah, if you just jump to the next slide. So first of all, if you haven't already, it's really important to share your plan and your ideas with your employees and your stakeholders. That board buy-in is really essential, and they need to come on this journey with you in order to make sure it's successful. Gathering data and understanding your carbon footprint can take time, but with the help of digital calculators, the length of the process will be hugely reduced. Once you understand your footprint, you can work on setting goals and reporting on progress. So the sooner you start there, the better. And once you start gathering that high quality data on your operations, you'll really quickly be able to identify hotspot areas that contribute the most to your carbon footprint. And then you should target these areas as a priority. There are many resources available online as well, which we can also send around after this webinar, including things like the Science Based Targets Initiative website itself, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, plus a number of topical blogs and webinars, things like that on our website as well. When it comes to measuring your emissions, it's really worth spending some time on finding the right partner to help you achieve your goals. So whether you decide to go with a fully managed consultancy service or a platform that helps you gather data and calculate emissions, these options will really provide you with that confidence and ensure you're conforming to industry standards. So just take the time there. And then if you just jump onto the next one, so we understand that it is a huge task at hand, and it might seem pretty daunting, but the best thing you can do is just get started. And you really don't need to wait until you have a strategy in place to start reducing your emissions. If you just remember to take it one step at a time and celebrate the small wins along the way, because it really won't happen overnight. So yeah, really hope that this has been useful today. And if anybody wants to reach out to me or Sylvia after this webinar, if you've got any questions or would like to have a call just to discuss anything further, then we'd be more than happy to jump on the phone, understand a bit more about your situation, and yeah, just take you through how we might be able to support or make any recommendations. But yeah, for now, I'll just hand back over to Faye, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Becky and Sylvia. I really hope that gave everyone an appreciation of the fact that the route to net zero is not simply one thing that you can do. It's something that businesses are going to have to continue to look at, to assess, manage and progress. And, you know, I think this is a living, breathing journey. If you flip to the next slide, the contact details for myself, for Becky and Sylvia are up there. There are some QR codes. I'm told that if you scan them, that'll take you to our LinkedIn profiles. But feel free to drop any of us an email or call. We will send the slides round afterwards as well. In the Q&A, we haven't had any questions yet, so if you've got any, please do pop them in the Q&A. There is also a feedback form. It would be great to get any feedback that you've got, and particularly if there's any further sessions you would like us to run. As I mentioned, we will be publishing a report in the new year on good governance within businesses. I think the E and the S within ESG are fairly well understood, and people have got plans in place for that. But if the G isn't right, if you haven't got your governance, then how are you going to hold yourself to account on the environmental and the social? So that's something that we'll be looking at as a firm in the new year, and I'm sure we'll be presenting that to you. And if you've got particular interest, do just drop me an email. I'll make sure that you receive that report. So I still haven't had any questions, but I do have a couple that I can throw out there. So first question is just science-based targets. We've talked a lot about them. How do I get started with setting my science-based targets? Where on earth do I start with this? Because it kind of feels quite overwhelming in terms of all the different, you know, emissions, etc. I don't know, Becky, if you've got any hints on that.
Yeah, I think it does seem like a pretty huge task. And as I said, there's all that information available on their website. They do have a really good website. But first of all, it's really important to understand those material categories for your business across scope 1, 2 and 3 based on the sector you're in. And then you'll need to calculate your baseline emissions in order to understand how much you need to reduce your emissions and what initiatives you'll need to set in place. So I think that's a good place to start. And it's really just keeping in mind whether you want to set that near-term, long-term target and really understanding what works for you.
Fantastic. So getting that data, that baseline, so then you can work out what your next steps are. Great. And then another question, which kind of goes back a little bit to the session we did previously on carbon footprint, is engaging with your own suppliers when you're setting science-based targets. Is that something you need to do? Do you need to worry about that sort of thing?
Yeah, so part of setting a science-based target is working with your own supply chain to reduce those supply chain emissions, which for most companies tends to be the biggest by far part of your emissions, up to 90-95% sometimes. So it can be really complex to work with your supply chain because for a whole variety of different reasons. But yeah, it's really important to develop those relationships with your suppliers, work really closely with them in partnership to achieve your decarbonisation goals, because it will be really difficult to do without them.
Fantastic. And as an aside on that, we're starting to see in some of the contracts that some of our clients are putting in place with their suppliers, clauses on providing information and enabling audits and that sort of thing on some of these issues around carbon and science-based targets. So actually using the a bit of carrot and stick, but using some of that stick in your contracts isn't a bad idea. Don't have any more questions, I believe. Let me just check. But I just want to say thank you all for listening. We'll wrap up now. As I say, if you've got any questions, I'm sure Becky and Sylvia will be more than happy to have a chat with you. The details are on the screen. Otherwise, we really look forward to hosting another session in the new year. This is an ongoing topic. ESG isn't going away. It is important, and it's really critical to actually success of each of your businesses. So I want to say thank you very much to Becky and Sylvia. Your insight's been fantastic. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us. And oh, hang on, we have got a question. Oh, excellent. Quick one question before the end. What one or two things that have been implemented will give you the most bang for your buck, so to speak? So I think you mentioned some of the quick wins that you can do. I don't know, Becky or Sylvia, if you've got any suggestions, or what are the one or two things that you can do that can reduce your carbon very quickly and efficiently, as quickly as possible?
Did you want to take that one, Sylvia, or should I?
You can add to it if you have another suggestion, but one of the quickest way really is to review your energy contracts and make sure that you identify providers that can get you on the green tariffs. That typically helps a lot with your own emissions. Obviously, most of your emission will rely on your supply chain, so there is also a quick win to have here by making sure that you work with suppliers that are also on a similar decarbonization journey.
That's great. Thank you, Sylvia. And as I mentioned, that's actually, I think, one of the first things that Irwin Mitchell has done. And I think by next year, we're looking to ensure that 100% of our electricity comes from renewable sources. So that is a simple step that businesses can take now. I haven't got any more questions, so I will wrap up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Becky and Sylvia. And I look forward to speaking to you at our next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.